very, very good day to all our viewers and listeners from across the continent, across the globe. I am very delighted to welcome us to yet another edition of the Fourth Generation Initiative. And those that have been part of our journey so far know that we consider ourselves as participating in a very important generational task, which is trying to explain and find meaning to describe the reality of politics and everything that it touches in Ugandan society and African contexts within which Ugandan society exists. And the Ideological College, of which this is the third conversation in that series, is really at the very forefront of ensuring that we platform very important conversations that the young demography of Ugandans and the intellectuals within that young demography are attempting to have, so that they can actually do what Franz Fanon tasked them to do, which is fulfill their generational mandate. Now, on to today's discussion. Today we have a very unique discussion as well, in addition to all the other special conversations we've had. And we are lucky in a way because the focus of today's discussion will be one of our key panelists, a very regular face here on the show, none other than Olemo Gideon, who published his undergraduate thesis in April of this year. So this is very fresh intellectual work, and we hope to hear fresh ideas, not the same old, not the same old sloganeering that has been put forward by older scholars. I may have mispronounced the name of our author. It is Gordon, not Gideon. These colonial names can be a little confusing at times, but we have to encourage the Pan-Africans to reclaim their names. But Comrade Olemo Gordon, Brian, and I beg to be excused for that. So without further ado, really, I would like to welcome Olemo to take up the stage and give us a brief 10 to 15 minute dive into what this thesis is, the state at State House, the politics of presidential parallel governance in Uganda. Quite a mouthful, but we are provoked by the ideas. Our appetites are whetted. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Manzi, for that. They say that a rose by any other name still smells as sweet. So I don't think the name is immaterial, but I'm grateful to discuss this thesis that we began thinking about sometime last year, right? So for my senior year, I had the opportunity of writing an honors thesis in political science, which was one of the disciplines that I studied for my undergrad studies. And so around a year ago, I was thinking about the question that was going to be around. I knew from some of the interactions that I'd had, some with even Trevor on this call, that I had to do some undertaking, right? I had to spend myself doing something or investigating something deeply as a culmination of the 4 years of my study. So I elected to do that thesis, right? And when I was thinking about that question, I remember reading an article, and one of the things that was foremost on my mind at that point was the question of domestic capital in Uganda, particularly the question of how do we mobilize an organic domestic domestic capitalist class that can drive structural transformation. I think I must admit from the onset that the drive for that question came from, or the thinking around that question came from some of the questions that had been raised or left by Trevor's own thesis before. So I was thinking, okay, how do we then create, or how do we mobilize, foster an organic domestic capitalist class in Uganda, but also in any developing country in the world that's at the periphery of the global economy? And that led me to an article that I read on the experience of one of our businessmen in the country. I wouldn't call him a capitalist in the sense of which I was thinking about an industrial capitalist class, but he's one of our businessmen in the country. And in the article, something came up, and that was the name of the one of the president's advisors then, who also happens to be his son-in-law, Mr. Odrek Rabogo. And particularly in that article, what was cited was the name of an organization called the Presidential Advisory Committee on Exports and Industrial Development. I think the members there call it PACEID, right? So I was naturally curious, okay, a committee that is in charge of exports and industrial development. So I looked it up and saw the work that they were doing. So initially they said, the think tank that is concerned with advising the president on, exports and just industrial development in the country, which is very critical for Uganda, right? If you look at the national development plans, you look at the direction that the country wants to take, the people we are concerned about, there is now a reorientation almost towards outward oriented development, towards export led development, as opposed to the import substitution regime that we had before, and then subsequently, because of neoliberal reform, that shift towards thinking about exposing ourselves again to global trade. So exports have been a big conversation in Uganda. If you read our national development plans, you read the Vision 2040, we are all up, every department in government is thinking about how we can boost exports. So naturally I was curious, okay, PACEID, think tank, I said, okay. And it made sense because Rabogo was the president's, special advisor, then no advisor in charge of special duties, one of over 130 advisors the president had by that time, So, but as I read deeply into the work that PACEID was doing, and I also looked at their presence online and some of the messaging that they were pushing on their website and also on their social media platforms, I realized something that was very curious, and that is that they were playing the role. They were not just an advisory committee in the sense of a group of people that are informing the opinion of the president on our export policy and on industrial development in the country. They are actually an export promotion organization, in essence. Within the literature, there's this term, trade promotion organizations, TPOs, that are basically, galvanizing all departments in government to see how we can, boost and promote export development in the country. So it was not an advisory committee. That was one of the things that I realized, right? That PACEID is anything but a simple advisory committee of the president. It is actually an entity, it's an institution in government that is doing work that is being undertaken by another government institution. In this case, it was the Uganda Export Promotion Board. So the mission that PACEID had assigned itself, and it was commissioned by the president officially, right? So the mission that PACEID had assigned itself was, or the mandate that it had assigned itself and was executing, was the exact mandate that the Uganda Export Promotion Board, which is a government institution as well, under the Ministry of what ministry is that? There's a ministry. I'll get it. That other
It's not
similar
trade.
government. Yes, it's the Ministry of Trade, actually. Ministry of Trade. So they now, so obviously that presented its own challenge. So I was asking myself, okay, why does this institution exist? They're calling themselves a think tank, and they're doing the same exact functions that UEPB is carrying out. And then I landed on an interview that the then executive director of the Uganda Export Promotion Board, Eli Tuneo, then did with NBS, I think with one of the anchors called Mwangoya, and by then the president had just come back from Serbia launching a trade hub in Serbia, which was an initiative of PACEID. And he was being asked, why is it that UEPB did not feature in Serbia? We didn't see you as the executive director. We didn't see anybody. And yet the trade hub is a key strategy to boost Uganda's exports to what? To that part of the world, to Eastern Europe, that is. And then that is when it became very clear that this is what I then ended up terming in the thesis as parallel governance or parallel economic governance, right? That what Twineo basically did was admit that, there's this institution that had been created that benefited from presidential sponsorship, and they were doing the same exact function. But something else that was more sinister was that he was very explicit about the fact that they were being kicked out, right? They were being marginalized essentially by this new institution that was carrying out what was a mandate of this statutory body, which is UEPB. Yeah. Obviously the mechanisms of accountability and recognition for PACEID is very different from UEPB, that is, mandated and was brought into force by an act of parliament, I think at the turn of the century. So I was naturally curious about the why. Like, why do we have this body? Yes, export development is important for Uganda. Yes, we need to nurture our capitalist class. We need to, help our local business elite to be able to export better. It's good for our books, all of these things. So, but why do we have two bodies doing the same thing? Same thing. And obviously, there's now UEPB is not the first institution in government that is housed at State House. Sorry, not UEPB, but PACEID is not the first such entity that is housed at State House that is carrying out similar functions as other government entities. There's so many of them, right, that benefit again from presidential sponsorship. And so I was asking myself naturally, why is this the case? Are there other reasons beyond the ones that Ugandans will naturally suspect? Because if you asked any Ugandan on the street, even without the head of PACEID being the president's son-in-law, they'll point to corruption, right, as the main one. Some of the people that I spoke with, I remember at that point told me, no, PACEID is just, and some people who had even worked for the organization, who had been poached from UEPB, said, no, this is actually just a front for accumulation by the president's son-in-law, So, but then I said, okay, let me just give him the benefit of doubt and assume for a moment that this is not the case and explore this as a case study for a larger phenomenon of parallel governance. Why do we have institutions, economic institutions in particular? I was focused on economic institutions because, again, in the literature, there has been a long tradition of study in Uganda of, the personalization of state power, the centralization of state power at State House around the presidency. One of the, and I was, this for me was a discovery because I was not very well aware of this academic career of Andrew Mwenda, featured a lot with, I think, his co-author, Roger Tangri. I think he's a British man. And they had done a lot, they'd written a lot about, the malaise of government, of the state personalization of power, centralization of power in State House, and how institutions particularly existed in State House that duplicated functions of those in the mainstream government and bureaucracy. But however, I looked at most of the literature and I think much of it was concerned with sort of like the judicial angle, the military angle, the fact that, for example, in Uganda, we have so many, institutions that are sort of parallel in a sense to check one another and as a coup-proofing strategy. So the judicial angle, the military angle. But I felt like the economic angle had not been well considered, right? And so I sought out then to say, okay, is there a way we can explain parallel economic governance in the country? So, when I undertook to do that, obviously I did some reading around, and then I also read some works that had been published by other people in other contexts, right? So one of those contexts, the main context was Latin America, where a man called, I think, Polga Hesimovic had, he might be European, had in 2013 done work on bureaucratic circumvention. Now, bureaucratic circumvention is not the same thing as parallel governance. It's more a feature of parallel governance to say, why was it that in Latin America you had cases whereby presidents went ahead to sideline the mainstream bureaucracy and form their own teams and to do the same functions that other institutions existed, ministries, departments, agencies, MDAs, were already doing. And so for me, that was a good point to draw some of the hypotheses that then I went with, into this research. I decided to give them the benefit of doubt and say, okay, it's not simply a question of corruption, and clientelism, but that there may be other reasons. So I looked at that and then I came up, I think there were three main things, right? The conclusion was that, okay, the president is generally committed to boosting exports, right? And promoting industrial development in the country. That's attracting foreign direct investment in the country. Some of the functions that PACEID had, taken up. Actually, they took up more functions than that. Some of the functions that are being carried out by the Uganda Tourism Board as well, PACEID is doing that. Some of the functions that are being carried out by Uganda, then Coffee Development Association, they are doing that as well. So they really subsumed a lot of functions that are being carried out. And one of the things I was curious about, even before we go into the hypothesis and the conclusions that we drew, was that they were also working in silos, right? So there was no communication between PACEID and UEPB at all, right? Despite the fact that they are doing the same things, essentially. One of the complaints that UEPB, for example, had, and I read a lot of government documents, even a parliamentary vote that they had when they were being allocated a new budget, was that they were underfunded, severely underfunded. And then you find out, and we can go into a deeper discussion of this later on, that PACEID had quite a budget and they benefited, of course, from the fact that State House has a classified budget and being an institution that is nested within, the presidency, they benefit from that, classified budget as well. But beyond that, PACEID also went to Parliament as well to ask for money, right? Which caused quite a controversy. Actually, after writing the thesis, Rabogo himself featured in an interview on KFM, right? And he was being roasted by this MP. This man who was previously in FDC. What's his name? Ibrahim
Semujunganda.
Semujunganda. So he featured there on that interview, and they roasted him and they're asking him, okay, why does this organization exist if it's doing the same work? So this was after, I think this was I wrote the thesis in April, and this was in May, I think, the month after, or 2 months after that interview happened. So I said, okay, there are people who are really noticing this. Now, I wasn't the first person to notice the phenomenon of parallel governance in Uganda, right? Much of these questions had already been raised in newspapers before, particularly those that tend to be more critical in government, and now they're being, sidelined. I know. So I wasn't the first person to point out that, oh, there's this thing that exists called parallel economic governance. I just, decided to integrate it and then say, okay, can we answer the question all together in a more, investigative, disciplined manner? But people had already lamented about it, particularly because of, and it came up because of the policy of rationalization. If you recall, there was a government, policy that I think began in 2020 officially, but the debate had begun earlier of rationalization of government agencies. So the government pointed out that there was a lot of wasteful expenditure, there was a lot of duplications of functions and mandates within ministries, agencies, and different government institutions and departments. And we can talk about how that started, right? How those agencies came about. But then, so people were raising the concern that if the president is a foremost advocate for rationalization, why is it that there are all these entities that are that are nested in State House that are essentially carrying out that are doing the same thing, for which is trying to cure with rationalization, right? So that was a concern that came up. So when Rabogo was asked to justify the existence of PACEID, he could not essentially do that. He just defaulted to, the necessity of an export promotion organization, or agency existing, but it did not really give a justification for why why you have an additional institution that is carrying out the same function. So he was a bit shaky, and defaulted to, personalist attacks that you just know, okay, there's something fishy going on here. So, I still was quite generous in my thesis again, as just a general. I tried to abstract it, right, and say, okay, why would this exist? Why would parallel economic governance exist in any context? Is it useful? Does it deliver? Is it better as an economic, as a governance strategy? Because part of governance is strategy. And so I came down to three things, right, or at least four things. The first was based on the study that somebody did in, Brazilian municipalities, a scholar called Toral, and he was investigating what he called patronage. And patronage simply was just personalist appointments of people to the bureaucracy, right? And he was trying to say, okay, how helpful is this? And so the first hypothesis, or the first argument, or that I came up with in the thesis was from that result, to say that then these personalist ties might be the explanation for why these bodies exist. That the president, for example, decides to make his brother the head of Operation Wealth Creation, to make his son-in-law the head of PACEID, which is an export promotion organization, because the relationship, that the personal ties that he has with these guys, makes them easy to monitor. It makes them, more accountable to the president, and then gives them a different set of incentives to do a good job as compared to if there was anybody else. So the first argument was about the people who are actually leading this, that these entities exist within State House because of the people that head them. That was the first argument. And then the second hypothesis was around, again, connected with the first, but a research that somebody did again in Latin America, the one I mentioned before, on bureaucratic circumvention. And his argument was that bureaucratic circumvention is likely to happen if one, the policy, or what the policy in question is, of importance to the principal, to the president in this case, right? So the set of three factors. One, it was, policy importance, and then the other one was ideological alignment. So the people that, if the president feels that the bureaucracy is not ideologically aligned with him, is likely to come up with a different group of people to deliver on a policy that he thinks needs to be delivered on, right? That he thinks is important. And then the other one was the capacity of the existing agencies or institutions. Now, I did something in the thesis. That is, I considered and said, okay, was it that UEPB was doing a bad job? And that is why the president thought it necessary to come up with a whole different agency altogether to replace it. And UEPB has delivered within the constraints that it had. That was my conclusion, right? I looked at some of the work. I looked at how Uganda's exports, again, within the realities of being an economy in the periphery, right? I think UEPB has done a good job, even with international, acclaim. It has won an award before internationally among export promotion agencies. It has been acknowledged internationally. Studies have, given it credit for the work that it has done, with the limitations that it had. The thesis has some graphs about how much that has changed. Obviously, structurally, not much has changed in terms of the markets that Uganda has access to, in terms of the products and the diversity or the complexity and the diversity of our exports. Some things have been done, but not very significantly, in that we are still a commodity dependent country, for example. So already on the question of existing, or the capacity of the existing bureaucratic organization, I concluded that, okay, if UEPB is not delivering, it cannot be because it's to be blamed. They don't have the finances that they need, and I saw government documents to back that up, and they don't have as much support generally. So you could not justify it on those grounds. But in terms of policy importance, export development is important to the president, and also ideological alignment. You can say Rabogo, being an NRM cadre or cadre, is close to the president. He speaks the same language with the president, basically. Musevenomics and all of those things, right? He understands the president's language, speaks his language. So that was the conclusion on that matter. So maybe that is a justification, those two grounds. And then the third reason was just something about, I tried to consider, okay, is it just the imperative of developmentalism? There's something that Nyerere once said. He said, again, if others are walking, we must run. All right. That is, for if you're the president of a developing country, whatever other countries are doing, you must do that faster, because you are dealing with a whole different set of problems. So part of maybe I'll just, because of time, I'll just try to summarize there. Part of the insight there was, okay, the newly industrializing countries of East Asia, what we call the developmental states of East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, those countries had, particularly South Korea, which the president has admitted before that is his vision for Uganda's modernization project, right? Have had similar initiatives during their high growth or miracle, what people have now called their miracle growth phase, right? Park Chung-hee, for example, had his own team of economic, cowboys or hitmen, you can call them, embedded within the presidential palace, that literally circumvented all the other institutions that they had, the economic planning board, the ministry that they had at that point that was in charge of, their high industrialization drive. So they had these guys who are more mobile, they could do things directly for the president, but often in circumvention again of the mainstream bureaucracy. So that was the conclusion then, that maybe the imperative to do things faster is what makes the president come up with these institutions. And then the last one was just a revisitation of the initial thing that I ignored, which is corruption and nepotism. And you cannot ignore the possibility of that. There's too many gaps, and I can go into a discussion of why corruption and nepotism is still relevant if you have time. But yeah, that was the crux of the thesis, that this is a tool for developmental control, that the president still views himself as, and the NRM as, there's this concept of securitized development that people have come up with, the NRM as the party that is supposed to deliver development akin to what the East Asian states did, and so you need a bit of developmental control closely aligned with the president. So yeah, that was the thesis.
Thank you, Comrade Olemo. Gordon, this time I'll make sure I emphasize the colonial name, right, for really compressing 151 pages of serious scholarship into slightly under 20 minutes of a synopsis. And I think we now get the crux and the gist of what it is that you're driving at. And for me, this is exciting because in this tripartite conversation, I am probably the pedestrian here. I'm the man on the street. And, I am in the company of two scholars who are doing living scholarship that is actually speaking to each other. And that's the exciting thing. We have young citizens of an African republic who are questing deeply and very fundamentally to find answers to very elusive problems. Luere, a couple of years ago, published his bachelor's thesis that, since he is here, I am sure I have the right to say this, that was just lamentation, casting, aspersions on the efforts, on the efforts of older generations, but without providing any solutions, and it is good to see Olemo, follow in those footsteps and try to actually now follow up and provide a solution, at least in trying to explain, some of the strategies that have been adopted by a sitting government. So at this point, I would like now to bring in Luere, Trevor, soon to be doctor, if I am not mistaken, to to tell us what he thinks of Olemo's response to his and other scholars' questions. Over to you.
Of course, Manzi, you're mistaken about many things. The first thing is that analysis is meant to enhance understanding, not necessarily to be concerned with proffering solutions. So, what we may term as lamentations are in fact very useful for advancing the cause of understanding, because the central question of those intellectual preoccupations was, why haven't past approaches worked? Okay. And the answer to that is not therefore what should work. The answer is, why didn't they work? Okay. And even when those might sound as lamentation, the question is, why didn't they work? But that is a good segue into Olemo's intervention, which I think is also in a way an attempt to understand how these various attempts actually work. Now, of course, the scholarly context has its limitations, the strengths notwithstanding. So I'll say a few things informally first, and then maybe I can say some things in a formal sense. I think for me, the question of why parallel governance exists, which Olemo attempts to answer through a comparison of PACEID and the Uganda Export Promotion Board. That question does not turn on whether Uganda's exports are growing, right? So changes in export volume, but it turns on changes in the profile and structure of Uganda's exports. Now, the evidence that Olemo adduces is to the effect that, oh, look, Uganda's exports are growing. UEPB is winning awards. Therefore, they were doing a good job. But in fact, that's not the president's vision or any good person of goodwill towards the country, that let us export more raw coffee, potatoes, groundnuts, etc. But how then do we transform those? In fact, as further, what do you call it? Indictment really on Uganda Export Promotion Boards, that now it has even been merged with the Uganda Free Zones Authority to form the Uganda Free Zones Authority and Export Promotion Board, which has now become one entity. But even further to that, i.e., what does the answer to the question at hand turn on, is why that structural transformation and change in profile of exports did not occur. Okay. My reading of the president's mind and my limited exposure to and understanding of public service in Uganda and pretty much across the continent is that there is a conventionality, a usualness, a lack of creativity and radical thinking amongst the public service. And so that makes it difficult for them to transcend certain limitations that are necessary to be transcended to deliver the kinds of outcomes that are transformative. Okay, what do I mean by that? That yes, there are things that our public servants have been trained to do wherever they've gone for their education, at home or abroad, but that those approaches which they have front-loaded have in fact not been effective. In fact, that is the same spirit within which I asked the question that, look, we have tried both statist and market approaches to development. Why hasn't there been transformation? And then you show inherent limitations. Okay. Now, if you execute or implement both those approaches to textbook style within the constraints of post-coloniality and neo-coloniality, you may not transcend them. It takes certain creativity, a certain madness to think in the outside the proverbial box. Okay, and so the president's frustration is that people fail, one, to understand his vision, 2, internalize that vision. 3, deliver effective strategies to execute that vision. Okay? These are not bad people. Public servants are not bad people. They are working hard, they're trying, but they drink from intellectual and scholarly cups that inhibit their capacity for radical transformative thought that then can translate into meaningful transformative outcomes. Okay? So, yes, we can adduce evidence that the Uganda Export Promotion Board was working, which could easily even be a correlation that exports were growing under the aegis of the UEPB. It could have been for other factors, good rains, donor support, and of course, because it's a political economy analysis, you can't get into quantitative estimations of how much of this impact can we attribute to UEPB or other causes. So the first point being that the evidence adduced is a little bit wobbly for 2 reasons. One, that it takes correlation for causation, and it's understandable given the limitations of the methodology or approach taken, i.e. political economy analysis. But number 2, that it just ever so slightly falls short of getting to the heart of the matter, i.e. if the question turns on transforming the profile and structure of the exports, why hasn't that happened? And what is the president's frustration about the people who he has entrusted to execute this? So the solutions that Maz is looking for, and I'm happy and glad that he hearkened to that great forefather and forerunner of ours, Frantz Fanon, is that we must think new and different ways. Okay? I appreciate the historical experience of so-called newly industrializing countries like South Korea, like Hong Kong, like Taiwan, like Singapore, but often the reading of those histories is not properly situated historically and geopolitically. Because the things they have tried to do or that they did, many other nations have tried. Tens, dozens of other nations have tried, but the outcomes have been different. Why? Because the decisive factor ultimately is not largely in the control of these countries themselves. Because development under the capitalist modernist dispensation requires access to capital, access to markets, access to technology. Okay? And in all those cases, there was privileged access to all those 3 core inputs. And that access was given by the preeminent powers of the day for geostrategic reasons. So even if you're Uganda or South Africa, Morocco or Tunisia, and you try the same strategies, without that shaping circumstance of the coincidence of geostrategic interests between you and the powers that be that then grant you access to these core inputs to social structural transformation of your economy, you may not achieve it. Okay? And suffice to note at this point that we are yet again at such a historical juncture, a moment that is giving a window of opportunity to those who are alert, where the renegotiation of the power balance in the world is creating opportunities for powerful countries to consider offering some of these concessions to allies and partners in the developing world. That much has been stated in the recently released National Security Strategy of the United States by President Trump. Of course, Africa wasn't the focus. There was maybe a paragraph or 2 about Africa in there, very thin on detail and a general show of lack of interest, which is okay. We're not core to the American interest. But the point being that now in its recalculation of how does it maintain its staying power, either as a regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere or as a great power as opposed to a superpower. So as a great power on the global stage, it has shown a willingness in writing to make concessions that facilitate the economic development of other parts of the world, which means access to technology, access to markets, access to capital. Now, those that are alert will figure out ways of capitalizing on that changed situation. Okay, so again, the point I'm trying to demonstrate here is that if the inquiry had gone further to say what is at the heart of the president's concern with the bureaucracy that incentivizes or pushes him to, at very great cost to the public, have these parallel institutions, would have gotten to the heart of the matter, which is the neo-colonial orientation of our public service, which of course the president has decried severally. Okay, so writ large, the challenges of state management and development in the African context are quite complex because you are trying to do things with a population that hasn't done these things in such a long time or ever in its history. In such a long time to mean that our organic development was interrupted by colonialism. And so we've lost that historical memory of how we're propelling our societies forward. And so most of us today, 99.9% of our population, we don't have the human capital to drive the sort of development that we need. This is not only at the technical level, but at the strategic level, because we are asking ourselves to do things that we have never done before. Those that have gotten the clarification at the level of thought, like the president has, and a few of his colleagues, comrades, peers, struggle with failing to mobilize a critical mass of others that have similar ideological clarity, but also strategic imagination to bring about these possibilities. Now you realize that time for development or structural transformation gets compressed, as you move through history, because now you're passing down lessons. The Americans obviously benefited from the British experience, but the Brits had nobody really to learn from. And so you realize that industrialization in Europe took a much longer time than it did in America or in Asia. But the Chinese, we say it's the shortest time in history, just 40 years of just a fundamental transformation of society. It is because they're not having to reinvent the wheel, okay? And benefiting from that geostrategic where by and large, you don't have that potential, those potentialities and capacities within the population to bring about the kind of transformation that you want. Both at the technical level, the critical mass is not there. You can have, 100 engineers out of Makerere every year, or even 500 out of all universities every year. What they've gotten trained in and how that speaks to the imperative of transformation is limited. So the problems of managing a state in societies like ours also require serious creativity. That these are things we've never done before. We're not a 250-year-old democracy or a 5,000-year civilization like China. We don't, like, those potentialities, we're just trying to farm them up now, to internalize them. They're not there. And the critical mass is not there. So if you have, I don't know, 30 or 40 ministries in the country, who are you going to run them with? Okay, political appointees as ministers and technical appointees as permanent secretaries, many of whom are really deadbeats. They just are there because they have hung around for a long time, in the case of the technical people. And they don't have
Trevor, if I may,
so as I conclude, I'm getting digressed.
Okay, okay.
Let me conclude. So okay. The point there being that I think that analysis should have been stretched a little further from the point of what really does the answer to this question turn on? And then what really is the content of the president's discontent with the public service? And how does that come about? Because then we start to generate solutions that speak to those serious and fundamental constraints within our population. Now, in conclusion, maybe this is the point where I can read the so-called formal prepared thing. Let me say that this is certainly a rich and thought-provoking intervention that takes and tackles a complex and underexplored phenomenon in the context of Uganda and Africa broadly, which is presidential parallel governance. It offers a compelling political economy analysis that advances our understanding of state transformation, state building and state transformation under long-term incumbency within the African context. I'm going to say three things in the formal part of my submission. One, the nature of the scholarly contribution. Two, what the strengths of the analysis presented are. And finally, the questions and critiques, of course, of which I've already started on. Now, the scholarly contribution of this thesis is important in several ways. First, that it shifts our study of Museveni's governance beyond the conventional focus on regime security or patronage or corruption, and introduces a new important perspective that is often ignored, which is developmentalism. Most people are convinced that all the president does is to secure his stay in power. But I think there is a real, genuine, and legitimate concern for development, i.e. developmentalism, that he has, which is often underexplored. And this is an important and meaningful driver of institutional proliferation at State House, as the author presents. This is an important intervention because most of the literature, as I've said, reduces Museveni's institutional choices to neo-patrimonialism and the logic of that. Secondly, the detailed case study of PACEID and UEPB allows the author to demonstrate that political leadership can reconfigure the administrative state to pursue economic goals outside formal structures. And here I call it administrative state. It's important because when the author says state at State House, we must be clear what part of the state. Is it the military state? Is it the security state? Is it the administrative state? What really he's tackling is the administrative bureaucracy. So the author demonstrates how political leadership can reconfigure the administrative state to pursue economic goals outside formal structures. So this enriches our understanding of bureaucratic circumvention, which he clarified as not being his area of focus, personalized presidentialism, and pockets of efficiency that emerge within regimes such as Museveni's. Finally, of course, that is important because it documents the institutional architecture at State House, an area that is often opaque for scholars, observers, commentators, and the general public. So that helps with shedding more light on what is otherwise usually an opaque area. Now, the strengths of this analysis. One, it attempts to be balanced in terms of the analytical lens by deliberately avoiding simplistic explanations and showing that there are more and other different causes of parallel governance, including developmental ambition, political settlements or managing politics, ideological considerations, but of course as well, patronage incentives. So we move beyond the patronage, corruption, nepotistic talk that really is just rentiarism to move more towards more legitimate causes of parallel governance institutions coming up. Two, it's good that the work is well integrated with the theory of the developmental state and how the president, of course, is influenced and inspired by East Asian experience and therefore tries to recreate that, which, of course, is justification for why a developmental perspective is important to pursue here in trying to understand parallel governance in Uganda. Three, it also gives us a fair treatment of a nuanced treatment of agency because it characterizes actors such as Odrek not merely as beneficiaries of nepotism, but also as people who have ideological alignment with the president, in particular in line with his developmentalist vision. So it's not that whoever the president appoints just wants to eat, as is common speak in Kampala, but some of these are genuine ideological allies of the president. You can debate whether Odrek is or isn't. The author seems to be convinced of that. But that nuanced treatment of agency is important because it's not the case that everybody who has sympathies for or supports the president or the NRM is in fact only interested in eating. There are people who are actually convinced of the ideological positions of the president and the party that he leads. And so that nuanced treatment of agency is important. And finally, there is an attempt to attend to the long-term consequences for institutionalism of this parallel governance, talking about the weakening of the formal state, the formal administrative state, its fragmentation, weakening formal agencies, undermining institutional autonomy, etc., etc. Now, in conclusion, what are the critiques? I've made the first one about the focus. Number two, how generalizable is the PACEID case? Is a question. Must we treat this analysis as local, i.e., unique to the PACEID and UEPB case, or can we generalize it sufficiently across the breadth of the Ugandan state, administrative state? I think if the next step of the analysis had been taken, then that could be generalized. Where it is now, maybe we can treat this as analysis for PACEID and only stretch it with certain care to other institutions in the parallel state. Two, we need to also think carefully about whether developmentalism is an independent causal force or a post hoc rationalization, i.e., that is coming after the fact. Now, of course, those that will critique will say, no, that is now an apology for the president. You're giving apologies for the president's corruption and nepotistic tendencies. So how do you firm up that argument that actually developmentalism is an independent causal force? And I think that is where Museveni has been largely misunderstood, and where literature that is, fair and balanced can really ground that aspect of his politics and leadership, the developmentalism, so that it doesn't come off as an apology for his politics. Three,
Loire,
maybe
I'm going to ask you to hold it there for now.
Two more points and I conclude. 2 more points on the critique and I
No,
conclude.
those 2 more points are going to come. You're going to get a chance to voice them. Because at this point, I feel you have done enough to insult the entire civil service of the country and call it deadbeat, and impugn
Those are your
the
words.
honor.
Those are your words.
No, I am simply quoting what you said earlier, sir. But I feel that, again, there is a lot of lamentation. And if I may revert to what I said earlier, that the man on the street, the ordinary Ugandan who is listening to this conversation and is really interested in the work of our scholars, of whom Olemo and Were now form part of those ranks. We want to understand exactly, where do you stand? Do you stand on the side of the oppressor or the side of the oppressed? Because you've both spoken a lot of English here, okay? But what we ordinary people feel, and who I am representing here, we feel that you're making excuses for sectarianism, for family rule, as Semujung Anta would say. And that is why some of these politicians are very popular, because they call a spade a spade. They don't say, parallel governance and developmental presidentialism. No, they say dictatorship, despotism, and family rule. So please, because this phenomenon is happening in the army. You have the son of the president as the CDF. It's happening in many other sectors of the economy. The brother of the president for a long time, Operation Wealth Creation, is just being run by a very close kinsman of the family and many other close relatives, blood relatives of the president in charge of key institutions. Is that the same phenomenon that is at play here? We want to know. Is it just too much English, or there's a place for common men like us? Please.
Again, thank you, Manzi. So I tried to, and particularly when undertaking such things, I think of school as, my thinking about school is that place that allows you to, it's almost like a strategic retreat of sorts, right? It allows you to first take yourself away from everything and then think about things in a clearer way, right? And so the motivation for scholarship has always been helping us arrive at the truth as closely as possible to the truth of the matter and not be afraid of the truth. So as you said, call a spade and not a big spoon, right? If it's nepotism, it's nepotism. Like if somebody's hiring his son-in-law to become his special advisor in charge of, special duties, and there is no qualification beyond the fact that the man is his son-in-law, or that somebody is being made to head a particular government institution, which is in charge of wealth creation because it's his brother and for no other reason. Like, we'll call it that. Like, I don't know any other reason why we should be afraid to call it that. But I think that, and I'll respond again to some of the concerns as well that Trevor raised, right? In his response. So this is how I always think about these things, is that if you are put in the same position, right, or if this was any different context, would things have been any other way? Is it possible that things could be any other way? And that is why, and this also, I'll join it to something that Trevor brought up, is the question of structure, right? Now, that type of pedestrian analysis of saying, oh, these people, anything that you see, you call it this. Now, the thing is, things are not always that black and white. Sometimes they are, right? Sometimes it's just nepotism. Sometimes it's just corruption. Sometimes it's just that, as Trevor said, some people in the civil service, you have these technical people. One of the reasons that surprise Ugandans a lot is that you have a lot of ministers, for example, who have no idea at all about the things that their ministries are doing, right? Like, we can call that what it is. But it's also a different question to ask, why is the president put in a position to make such decisions? Or should he be making such decisions? And I'll circle back to this issue as I respond to some of the things that Trevor was saying, because I think, and that the president, or President Museveni for that matter, we've not had any other president in the history of our country, and I hope we will have other presidents who has had as much hegemony, right, and autonomy from society. And that means that if he fails to make certain key decisions, then it's a missed opportunity. There are certain decisions that, being him, with the level of how secure the regime is, there are certain things that he can do, right? Certain bolder decisions that he can make that other people would not, in that kind of situation, be able to make, right? That he can sort of avoid being a populist of sorts, right? Because of just how much, that's my view, because of how much hegemony and autonomy he has from society, that they can make certain decisions, and however much unrest proceeds from those decisions, they can be contained. That's because of how the security of the regime, the fact that he has more than any other person been able to eliminate alternative centers of power and deal with all of that. But I'm going to circle back to that. I want to first respond to the things that Trevor raised, right?
No,
And then
before you move,
Yeah.
that's an important point, because I think an understanding of the Museveni regime also in part turns on that. You see, that stability and security of the regime that you're talking about does not precede the political settlement that would get appended or disrupted by taking anti-populist decisions. And the president is acutely aware of this. It is the political settlement that is giving the regime that security. That's an important point to understand, because what on the outside it looks like is that the president is all powerful, the president is like beyond reproach, but what makes that possible? That there's a political settlement that is guaranteeing that security. There is a consensus amongst the political class to keep things that way, provided they're able to keep getting what they can get from the center. If the man takes anti-popular decisions and that settlement gets disrupted, he is aware that he may be unable to hold on democratically, and he has no other way of holding on other than democratically. At least at least to make it appear like it's democratic, right? So the president is not strong a priori. It is because he has mastered a political settlement that gives him comfort, that he's able to get away and then appear like he's like beyond reach to all powerful etc. And in part, that has produced the consequence of him finding himself in a position where he actually cannot make those anti-populist decisions. When you try them with iron sheet thieves, what happens? Honorable Golobi's supporters are going to come from his village, where he packed the iron sheets in his compound, and protest why their son is being hounded, yet there are many other thieves from elsewhere. Now, if that happens, maybe the NRM doesn't get elected next time in that part of the country. If that happens in several parts of the country, maybe the NRM doesn't get elected in many rural parts of the country where the voter base for the NRM is. And if that happens, the president has no legitimacy to draw from the population, even a veneer of it. Okay, so it is known that the president is all powerful. That is preceded by a political settlement that is giving a sort of guarantee to his power. I thought it's an important point to make as we move forward in the discussion.
No, it's a very important point, and part of the thesis actually is a consideration of the political settlement, right? I actually wanted to make that one of I had to remove it from one of the, at least in the abridged, we're going to share both the abridged 24-page version and a 40-page version, and then the 151-page version. But if you read the longer version, there was a bit of a consideration of, okay, is parallel governance also an imperative? Like, is it are you forced into it because of the political settlement, right? That was part of what was considered. So I think definitely I agree that the president is not beyond reach, and he has mastered so well the philosophy of not giving an inch, right? Because he knows that if he gives an inch anywhere, people are going to take a mile. But we cannot take away also the facts that more than any other head of state that we've had before, his regime is the most secure, right? And so he has, there are certain there's a certain tract that Lenin wrote. I don't know if any of you read it, on the importance of gold now and after the victory of socialism. And he talks about the fact that you can buy yourself certain, you can buy yourself, you can make certain victories that allow you to retreat in a way strategically, and then make certain advances in such direction. So that's where I was speaking from. But that's a response to the last point. So, and also even the nature of the political settlement itself, how that has been configured, and what decisions could be made around it. Now, and I think I'll link this to something that Trevor began with, which I think was his foremost critique of the thesis, which was the fact that Uganda is in a unique position, which necessitates, because the thesis essentially is about governance strategy, right? Economic governance strategy, which is like the act of governance itself is very important, particularly governance towards developmental goals, right? Like that is very key. Like nobody can ignore it. Going back to what you were saying, Manzi, is that beyond all these sort of like, I don't want to call it Manichaean, but like black and white analysis of, oh, this one is the enemy of the people, this one is this tribe, etc. Like we must really be curious about to say, okay, sometimes if it's you, Comrade Manzi at State House, would you have, like, for example, generally, even without the strategy, if we placed a different figure, for example, in the opposition right now in State House, would they have drastically different results from what the NRM has been able to achieve? Like we must be very honest about that, right? And so structural factors are always important. For example, one of the biggest underlying motivations behind the thesis was the question of exports, right? And export development. And I'll speak to this as well. And there are a lot of factors that make Uganda a commodity dependent country, right? Now, somebody will think, okay, it's because, the president does not want exports to develop. That's why Uganda, maybe if we see a statistic that places Uganda among the worst
if I may
exporters,
just interject briefly,
we'll just say it's because the president doesn't want it.
Semuju said it's because he's bad-hearted.
so you see, like now we attribute it to the character of the president and the commitment of the president. I dedicate a significant chunk of that thesis to say that I genuinely believe that the man is committed to moving the country forward. Like that is, now that assumption is not shared. Like you see the works of scholars and people don't think that Museveni is committed at all to the development of Uganda, that for him it's a personal enrichment project. I don't share that view. I think at least nominally, even enlightened self-interest would dictate that he is interested in the forward march and the progress of the country, and you wouldn't go all the length of making the sacrifices that he and the NRM made if you aren't at least nominally interested in the development of the country. So I think that some grace needs to be given there. But to respond to that question, so Trevor brought up the question of the need for innovative thinking in governance. I believe that, particularly for a context of Uganda, the country is just 50 years old, in a very particular context. So you need to innovate, right, in thinking creatively about how you govern. And this was the imperative of the thesis, actually, because I could have just stopped at saying, okay, this is corruption. Like, there's no need to investigate this. There's not, like, if you went and surveyed Ugandans on the street, they'll tell you Rabogo is the man's son-in-law. He needs a source of accumulation. The president made him the advisor to accumulate still, and that is why. Why else are we investigating? But I said no. Let's abstract and think. Okay, can this be generalizable? Can we get other potential explanations? It might even be a good thing, right, in terms of where we are as a country. So I gave that. I acknowledge that fact in approaching the thesis, and that is what then made me to go say, okay, maybe is this actually a creative project? Is it part of what the president has innovated under the constraints that is facing, to say that in a developing country context like Uganda, let's come up with parallel institutions that are close to me, that I can closely monitor, and then I can work with that. So, but for me, my skepticism with that, again, is in the conclusion, which I don't develop, and I can accept that I don't really focus on it. But my conclusion is that it sets us up for long-term failure if we keep depending on parallel governance as the model for our development. Now, it worked. It definitely worked in East Asia, where the president is clear-sighted. He has both bureaucrats, and I think in East Asia that was key, right? That they had bureaucrats who are committed to the project, who had also bought into the ideology, and a state that was working at once. And I don't know how we can speak about Uganda's bureaucracy and address the nature, but I think that was acknowledged, the fact that we need innovative thinking in governance, and that this might be the innovation. So I granted that, to start the thesis. But then that also begs the other question, that is, there's a lot of literature on pockets of effectiveness, that in contexts like Uganda, you need particular pockets of effectiveness that will deliver, where the mainstream bureaucracy that initially was hollowed out, because of forced neoliberal reform, is not delivering. Now, from my analysis, I do not believe that PACEID is a pocket of effectiveness. Now, Rabogo said that. He also attempted to say that in response to Semuju, that, to Honorable Semuju, that, you need pockets of effectiveness. But the question is, we must go to the level of analysis to say, what is PACEID doing that is so different from what UEPB is doing from a technical standpoint, right? Is there any market difference between the two institutions? The other part that I thought about was this: that okay, if it's that the bureaucracy is not delivering, and that you don't have somebody who is ideologically committed, why not just remove Twineo and make make this man Rabogo the head of UEPB? If it's a question of ideology and ideological alignment, right? And then further empower the institution. You looked at the budget, for example, that PACEID has, and it's like 10 times that of UEPB. Actually, more than 10 times, right? With that budget, any institution in government would be able to do what UEPB was doing. And so what PACEID is doing. And what was different that PACEID was doing? Three things. One, in terms of strategy. Again, going back what Trevor said, exports and export development is important. Export diversification, complexifying our exports is important. But we must ask, what is PACEID doing differently to address those structural issues? And I did not find anything to convince me of its necessity on that basis, right? The first thing that they are doing...
Let me interject here.
Yes.
You see, and now you're arguing against yourself, because you argue that there are certain advantages that parallel governance has over traditional entities. And now you're arguing that there's nothing that they're doing differently. So maybe it is not so much what they're doing differently, but their ability to do it with greater speed, and effectiveness. Because the bureaucracy in traditional entities is sickening. It is sickening. And perhaps even them being under the president's office means that they have access to a greater budget than if they're in the mainstream budgeting process of finance, where UEPB is just another entity they must give money, as opposed to where if the State House gets a budget and now they must be given, and now State House can prioritize differently, right? Under finance, the prioritization looks different. Under State House, prioritization also looks different. So it may not be so much what they're doing differently, although that is important, but also what constraints are they freed from by operating outside the traditional bureaucracy? Because traditional bureaucracy is extremely frustrating. They're going through procurement processes. I don't know, this one has to sign, so that it is a heck of a process. And people are just there safeguarding jobs and doing a lot of nothing. So yeah, that's an important.
No, definitely that's a good point to make. However, again, in looking at these things, that was a question that I asked myself. Okay, could the president easily influence how much in the mainstream budgetary process we give UEPB? Yes, and it's very easy for him to justify that publicly, just like we can justify the prioritization of sectors like, you know, our defense and other sectors. We can also bake that into our national development plan to say that
No,
because
he can't. Actually, he can't just directly influence. Otherwise, then there would be no point of having a budgeting process. You could as well just give the president to do the budgeting and assign what everybody gets. No, but there's a budgeting process where the president probably sees it at the end. This is how much you've allocated, and moves around what he thinks is most important without causing a lot of havoc. You see that? But also, you're going to give a ministry X a smaller budget. That's also a political problem, because that money has to come from somewhere. So this is what I'm saying, that the president's power may seem like it is omniscient, but it's actually not. Because there's a whole budgeting process that starts a whole year in advance. So for example, now I'm aware that the budgeting process for the next financial year, 2026-2027, is underway, right? It has already started. So that by July, next budget reading for next year, it would be ready. So it can't be that now the president is just given to say, you man, can you tell us what your priorities are? And we just write those out, as well as the money. I don't know, 14, 20 trillion. So yes, there are things the president can have direct influence over, but it's a parallel budgeting process, which again is also frustrating because those that are running it don't always necessarily share priorities with the president.
I'm also acutely aware of the dilemma that any Ugandan will face, to say at the same time you want, because you know it's a presidential system, you want the president to do more, but you're also aware of how much an over-empowerment of the president is going to how debilitating it's going to be in the long term for the entire administrative bureaucratic structure that we want to empower, because we keep talking about, you know, empowering institutions as opposed to the individuals at the top. So even posing that question, I understand it brings back that dilemma. But to just again, the other angle though, beyond even the president being able to influence the budget, that I considered is that PACEID actually does not draw from the State House classified budget. PACEID went to Parliament to ask for a budgetary allocation from Parliament, and it is not a statutory institution in that it was not established by an act of Parliament. And the concerns that then Honorable Semuju was raising then become legitimate concerns, to say that we did not set you up, so why are you coming to ask for money, right? We know you have presidential sponsorship, so why aren't you taking your money from the classified budget at State House? So that was the other issue, that if maybe they were purely drawing from the State House budget, then that's a different question, just like other presidential initiatives, right? You have the one with bananas, you have the, I think, OWC as well, and other presidential initiatives like that are directly nested at State House. And if you read the thesis, I list some of them in the appendix, right? So it's not just simply a question of, like, these guys were going to Parliament to ask for money. And that was when I reconsidered the question of whether some malaise, maybe some malfeasance may be there, essentially. Though that was one of the things I looked at. There was a controversy surrounding, for example, $10 million that was given for coffee funds development, involving, I think, some character called Tugume, whom the president personally supported, and parliament gave money to an individual to develop coffee in the country. And that was an issue. Like, why empower this individual this way? Right? And that money somehow just disappeared, and it just became very fuzzy explaining where that $10 million had gone. And then the other question as well, when I reconsidered whether there might be elite malfeasance involved, was the question of the Trade Frontier Fund. Now, we need an export financing facility in Uganda, because we need to be able to empower our, business class to be able to export. A lot of the anecdotes that I found when I was thinking about people's, exporting experience was not funny at all. Like, people face real constraints in being able to, like, get their goods out of the country. And the biggest one is finance, having somebody to guarantee, to write off their invoices and things like that, right? Like, I read, and if any of us tried, for example, it would be a very long process, and you're competing against Chinese exports, where China has an export, an Exim Bank. They are lending people at ridiculously low rates. So you need export financing. And around $1 billion was being raised through this Trade Frontier Fund, which is a good innovation and one of the things that set PACEID apart. But of course, questions need to be asked around, like, how this money was being allocated and where some of it was allocated also raised some questions in my investigation. So those are not things that you can, like, straight up write off, right? Now, I'm not contradicting myself in any way when I talk about whether PACEID, whether we're not thinking about PACEID in terms of its efficiency. No, my thesis is concerned with the why for its existence, right? And you have to ask yourself, if it's not doing anything radically different from the current alternative, then might there still be any other reason? The things that set PACEID apart, the Trade Frontier Fund, right? Now, what does it take to get the Trade Frontier Fund? I'm sure if you looked at the documents of UEPB, these are things that they would have wanted to do. And that was my concern, right? If you look at the trade representatives, that's the other bit. I have a whole table that analyzes all the export strategies, all the strategies that export promotion agencies around the world have employed, and the new innovations as well are included there. I update it, So I ask myself, okay, what are the differences between UEPB and PACEID as export promotion agencies? And you realize that it's simply the Trade Frontier Fund, an export financing facility, which really is not within the control of PACEID. The other one is, UEPB, or now UFZEPA, with the merger with Uganda Free Zones Authority. And then you have the other bit is what? The other bit is the fact that they have trade representatives. So PACEID has managed to enlist the help of certain individuals from different countries around the world that they say are scouting for them those markets. Now, this is part of UEPB's strategy, but they just could not do it, as Tuneo will tell you, because they did not have the money to do it. Right. So my conclusion was that it's not a lack of willingness and capacity. The lack of willingness and capacity can be explained by a lack of support and financing. And so my question then was that, could we have easily just empowered UEPB to do everything that PACEID is already doing?
But what it sounds like is like you're taking Turineo's explanation at face value. But whatever he said must be true.
I looked at the vote.
Hold on. You're saying because he says they couldn't do what PACEID is doing because they were underfunded. That could be a cop out. Okay, because these guys were founded 1996. And you're telling me that for all those close to 15 years, they had never persuaded the president to fund them enough. Like, how do you explain that with the president's talk endlessly about the importance of exports?
Trevor, right? Let me address that.
It could also be that you have a leadership that is incapable of marshalling resources. Everywhere you go in government, no one has enough money for anything. How do you prioritize the kind of funding you have and put it in the right places? Number two, perhaps even the question of trade representatives is not a question of money. Okay? Whereby if you have a Ugandan Serbian who is trading You enter into some memorandum of understanding, make certain concessions, and then they do that role for you. The same way you have what they call honorary consuls that are not people from that country, but they're from the country in which they represent. So say Chirumira, who is Namibia's honorary consul to Uganda, and now he has put a placard on his fence, residence of the honorary consul of Namibia to Uganda. I don't think they're paying him a single coin, but everywhere he goes is scratching his stomach, demonstrating his newly acquired diplomatic stature. But the point being that you also have to be careful not to take on face value what Tirineo and UEPB are saying, okay? Because it seems like, okay, it's the word of PACEID against UEPB. I'm not even saying that PACEID has done anything radically transformative. No, I'm saying that you cannot discount the fact the advantages to being outside the bureaucracy than being in it, which for me says two important things. Number one, that actually understanding how the bureaucracy works is important, because you could list all the strategies that UEPB had, but actually implementing those things is a completely different question, where competence comes in. I have read maybe strategic plans of like 5 different government entities in the last 2 months. I want to cry. I want to cry about the things they're writing, but they're sitting down, they're going for workshops in very expensive hotels, they're spending a lot of taxpayers' money, per diems, what, and producing total rubbish. And this goes back to what I said earlier.
Trevor,
This is one of the
if I may just make a quick clarification. Are you differentiating the bureaucracy in terms of ministries and MDAs, or are you lumping them together? Because MDAs seem to have been formed to redress exactly the problem of excessive bureaucracy.
Well, MDAs only means ministries, departments, and agencies. This is the same thing.
Okay, I mean the parastatus.
The difference between them is the autonomy you have. Who are you reporting to, etc., etc. An agency or an authority, for example, like SCCA, is self-reporting. Those ones account to Parliament, okay? And ministries, those ones, of course, they have ministers, for example, have an appointing authority. They're also accountable to Parliament, but they report nowhere else directly. You have departments that are not ministries, say the Department of Weather Forecasting at Entebbe. It's just a department that doesn't have legal autonomy per se, but some kind of semi-autonomy. So the legalese there is not important. But when it comes to accounting, how they get their money, how they procure, how they spend, what they can spend on, they're all caught in that. When you're outside the bureaucracies of government, and you're like a special presidential task force, a special presidential advisory committee, these ad hoc setups do actually have certain advantages that I don't want to be discounted. They have those advantages over traditional MTS. So it's not just a matter of, PACEID. Maybe PACEID is failing, right? This is independent of whether or not PACEID is doing well. The fact is, that being outside the bureaucracy can ameliorate.
Yeah, to respond to that, I think that's a very important point, and that is exactly the argument that the thesis advances, right? That there is advantages, and we've seen that even with history and the experience of other countries that have managed to accelerate their development, the led developing economies that have, particularly, again, we'll always go back to East Asia, right? That there are advantages to bureaucratic circumvention, if we'll call it that, even in places where the bureaucracy is just people are, as moonlighting, court hanging, all the things that you say, right? Or they lack capacity, there are advantages. So I'm not discounting that, but we need to go back to a real analysis. And you bring up an important point to say that we cannot just take what people, when you're doing research, take what people are saying for themselves at face value. And now, with that claim, I had to investigate that claim. And what I did was that I went to the exact budget conversation, so to the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, and I looked at the vote. I think they call them votes, which is like these things that you submit for the budgets. Again, part of the budgeting process that you're talking about. And the ministry acknowledged that this agency is underfunded. I referenced that in the thesis, that they complained that they wanted to do this, but they had no money to do this. They wanted to send trade representatives that they couldn't do it. Uganda obviously already has trade ambassadors embedded within the different embassies and consulates that we have around the world. And that's something that came to light as I was doing my interviews. So that is something that came from the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, a document that the current minister, Honorable PACEID, signed, right? That UPB wanted to do A, B, C, D, E, and they could not because of the funding. And that was part of the vote to consider them for the upcoming budget. So it was, I just did not take what Tuneo said at face value, right? So the capacity of UEPB was low. And to do some of the things that PACEID is doing, right? Not everything, but some of the things that PACEID is doing, because they were underfunded, they did not have the sponsorship, they also did not have the capacity. Obviously, if you look at the composition of PACEID, it's also a whole different group of people, right? You can see the capacity is existing. I'll surprise you to note that some of the staff of PACEID came from UEPB. Which is just very funny business at the end of the day, that now because you have this government institution that's better funded, then you go and poach folks from elsewhere, that further just disempowers its institution. And then obviously we can say you need the room for innovation and creativity, but some of these things need to be, investigated to that level. Yeah, profile structure. The first point that you raised was about what the intervention actually is. Are there structural problems? Again, to go back to that, I don't think that PACEID can respond to the structural problems of being a peripheral economy. It's just an agency, an entity meant to help us marshal resources, obviously help. There are problems on two sides, right? The biggest structural challenge that we have to the vision of outward-oriented growth is commodity dependence. And I don't think that that's a challenge that one entity in government can solve, right? The fact that we're a commodity-dependent country, that is that much of our export basket is comprised of, primary commodities, gold, coffee, and the likes. And so, but there are two challenges on the demand. That's on the supply side. And then there's also the other challenge of exporter capacity, right? The capacity for people who have already showed a willingness to push products out. One of the things you discover is that, for example, we were expelled from AGOA, right? We were removed from the list of AGOA countries by the US. But during my time at the Economic Policy Research Center, one of the things we realized, I learned from there, was that we were not even making use of AGOA at all. So it barely hurt us that we were removed from the list of countries that had preferential access to the US market. So that means there's a capacity challenge for exporters. And then on the demand side, obviously, there's the fact that there's even skepticism about Uganda. People are not aware of our products. Sometimes our marketing is very poor. You've seen all the images about how comparisons of like Ugandan stalls abroad compared to countries like Rwanda and things like that. And then trust of the products that we are taking out, standards, things like that. Those are not challenges that only one institution can solve. I think there are advantages to having an institution. And that's, now, PACEID has changed a lot in the way it has sold itself. And maybe that's just the nature of what bureaucratic innovation and creativity entails. But initially, advisory committee to the president and think tank. And then you now have the fact that it's carrying out the functions of a fully fledged export promotion agency. And now they're telling us that the focal point, which is what UEPB used to say about itself, that they are now trying to bring together all the actors in Uganda that are concerned with all the different facets of what it takes to promote our products abroad and to invite investment in and to invite tourism as well in. So it has taken so many shapes and sizes, and therefore it warranted the investigation that was carried out in the thesis.
Let me say something that I think is another important point to note here. You see, you seem to be making the tussle between PACEID and UEPB, or PACEID stroke the presidency and UEPB. But actually, what I'm trying to say to you is that the challenge is it's triangulated. There's a third arm there, which is finance. Okay, that if UEPB is being underfunded, for example, why is that the case? Who is doing the allocations? Should it take presidential intervention for UEPB to get preferential access to funding? The obvious answer is no. So who has the obligation for properly account planning and budgeting for the country? That is not the presidency, right? That is finance. And so the failure in bureaucracy may not even sit with UEPB itself per se, but with finance. So what the president comes in is to say, okay, and the other part where he has done this a lot is on the roads. He keeps telling you that for a very long time, finance was under prioritizing infrastructure. Why? Because there were IMF, World Bank people embedded there that did not think physical product infrastructure was important to fund. They were more so on social programs. And he puts his foot down from 2011. That's why you see most of the roads up country have been done, because the budget funding has been made. Should the president do that for every priority? Who is failing to make these allocations as properly as they should be done? Okay, so the failure of the bureaucracy is not only that UEPB failed to do its job, okay, but that finance fails to properly allocate limited resources to the necessary spending centers that exist. So the intervention by the president, what the president is saying is, okay, if because you're crowded by looking at so many things at once as finance, I'm going to pull out 1, 2, 3 as priorities, bring them close under my watch in the presidency or under State House, and then ensure that they're well funded. To do so, I may not be able to ban the existence of UEPB. That may take a whole legal process, parliamentary process, because these things are established by an act of parliament. But I can, by presidential decree, set up my own parallel entity that I can guarantee proper funding that you cannot overlook, because you give me a budget as State House, and then I will use that budget to prioritize what I think the most important things under my docket in the presidency. Okay, so the debate shouldn't be so much, did UEPB fail or not? But also, why did UEPB fail to do what it did? And if the cause you're identifying is that it failed to receive sufficient funding, why is that the case? That we don't have enough money in the country, which is true, but also that we're not prioritizing correctly. And who is doing the prioritization? And to be able to correctly see that, we must take away the impression that the president does the budgeting. He does not. I have been in a meeting recently where the president was, and he didn't have any kind words for finance. He was speaking about them in disgust. But you would imagine that he has kept around for a long time. Gobi, who is just brought in recently after he promised us economics that works, and Minister Kasaija was been Minister for Economics for as long as I can remember, for finance, okay? And of course, his deputies. So the point there that the failure of the bureaucracy is not that one entity failed, but the bureaucracy as a whole fails. And the president then has to rescue a function from the failure of the bureaucracy. If finance was manned by people who appreciate the value of funding, imagine the Minister of Finance bargaining for more funding for an entity that is only responsible for allocations. From the claim you're making that PACEID was UEPB was being underfunded, and the minister was saying yes, they failed to deliver this in this budget vote because they're underfunded. But the buck stops with you. You are the minister, okay? But you're also under pressure, political and otherwise. Gender wants funding, sports wants funding, education wants funding, health wants funding. You're in a poor country. So if you don't have clarity ideologically, then you're probably not going to do those allocations that they should be. And of course, you're also under the overwhelming influence. Many of these ministries of finance of ours are not run by our own people. They are run by IMF and the World Bank. And so you must look at the failure or the complexity of the bureaucracy not as PACEID versus UEPB narrowly, but, okay, more broadly, why is it that we fail to allocate money appropriately, as it should be? If your priority is right, you go and read the National Planning Authority, the National Development Plan, which of course is done by NPA, which is not under finance. Of course, the Ministry of Finance is called Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, but the function of planning is an NPA function that it does in close coordination with finance, but it is not done by finance, okay? So it's not the case that everything that NPA writes then gets funded or prioritized by finance. NPA writes a wish list of what we think should be the priorities of the country, and then finance makes a discretion of where they think money should go, okay? You would look, for example, there's a lot of talk about Science, technology, and innovation being the harbinger of the so-called tenfold growth strategy. And the projections by finance itself show that all other sectors combined are going to contribute a meager 20%. This includes oil and gas, agro-industrialization, and not minerals beneficiation, and tourism. Tourism, agro-industrialization, and minerals beneficiation, including oil and gas, will get us less than 20% of the $500 billion economy. Less than 20%. The rest supposed to come from STI. The other 80%, about $400 billion. How much is STI getting in funding? Less than 1% of the budget, not even GDP of the budget. As of the upcoming financial year, I think they're going to give STI around 380 billion UGX. That is how much Makerere gets a year. Okay, that's about only 1% of total fund of the total budget. But this thing is supposed to drive transformation of the economy. So then you ask finance guys, but you keep parroting about tenfold growth. You keep telling us about how innovation is the future of the country. You're funding at 1%. What are you doing? Should it also take presidential intervention to pull STI out of government bureaucracy and make it a specialized function, which he did, because he used to have a Ministry of Science under
He,
Dr. Eleda Tumwesije, and
he
now
did
he made
that.
it a secretariat under the
Yes, there
president
is. Yeah.
for the same reasons that the function had been captured. So the president, in part, of course, you cannot discount other motivations that, Mazi wants to talk about and Semujunganda, patronage, bad faith, what. But there's sort of a legitimate concern that the bureaucracy is failing to manage itself efficiently.
And Ugandans on the street, the majority.
Those ones that don't want to think, pedestrian thinkers, that the president is saying that the bureaucracy is failing to manage itself efficiently in terms of efficient allocation of resources, scarce resources. Okay?
Yeah.
So you must look at it more broadly. It's
Yeah.
not UEPB versus PACEID stroke the presidency. It is who really is failing UEPB that is making it necessary for the president to intervene.
Yeah, Manzi, I know you want to close
your
this
response,
now, but I'm
going to ask you to use this as a concluding remark, if you can.
Okay. Yeah, just to Trevor, I think you raise a very important point, right? A very important argument to say, okay, let's look at who is actually responsible for what. And I buy the argument, right? But in this particular case, it needs to be questioned, because ultimately what I found from my investigation was that if it was the case that PACEID, like the STI secretariat, was receiving money directly from the State House budget, from the classified budget of State House, then it would make sense to say, okay, because the president basically can ask for whatever he wants. I think Parliament has complained a lot before about the fact that, the president is running his own government in State House, right? And so the president can basically do that. And if he was the one who was fully funding PACEID, then that would make sense, right? But then the problem comes in when then PACEID goes to Parliament to ask for money, which is what people like Honorable Semujuganda were complaining about, that they went to him or they went to their committee in Parliament and they were asking for money. So that's the issue, right? That is coming up. But the overall point is taken.
But what is wrong with that? Because you yourself, you're saying UEPB was being underfunded. What is wrong with an entity that is doing work? You can debate the quality or importance of that work, but anything that is doing work, say the State House Anti-Corruption Unit, or State House HIV Monitoring Unit, or State House Health Monitoring Unit, want to ask for money from Parliament. That's on the wrong address, because Parliament does the appropriations, so they're definitely in the right place. Where else would they go to ask for the money from? Donors? Philanthropists? Broke Ugandans like Manzi?
No, I mean, obviously from what you raised before, if the thinking is that they are then going to be housed in State House out of budgetary concerns, then they should be able to be taken care of there. But I get the point that you're making, and this will lead to my conclusion as well, because I know Comrade Mazi will come for us for time, right? And we've been at this for a while. Is then I think this begs a different discussion then on what the trade-offs are between strengthening institutions in the country and what that might look like, vis-a-vis the imperatives of developmentalism. One of the books that my advisor gave me to read when I was preparing to write that thesis was a book that some of his friends wrote on compressed development, right? And just talking about those things, temporal time compression, the fact that the country we have to do a lot of things in very little time, right? But at the same time, the policy space as well has shrunk. Trevor was talking about how we, even within these bureaucracies, the people who are running these bureaucracies may not necessarily be the government employees there, but there are external influences. Actually, the term parallel governance, one of the applications of that term is that parallel state, that sometimes you have people other than Ugandans running the state. That is another application of that term. So I had to differentiate how I used it in the thesis. So I think definitely there's some usefulness to having a team of people who are ideologically committed to the program of national development, right? That are more mobile, that are more agile than the mainstream bureaucracy. But we need to be very clear about the effect of that on the empowerment of institutions. The trade-off is that we then not only not empower institutions, but we weaken them in the long term. Because people like Tuneo, then you can just go and continue court hanging. You basically have nothing to do. You're just there, placeholder. There's nothing that you're doing. You could see in the interview, the man felt dejected. He tried to defend himself that, no, we just need coordination. But you could see that the man was really dejected and he knew that he's being supplanted. And that was the reality, right? So it took for me coming to a conclusion that, but no, PACEID is actually an EPA. They're not just an advisory committee. They are doing the work of an export promotion agency, which is work that another government institution is already doing. Obviously, they try to mask that is not what they were initially, and that is what necessitated the thesis. But I think we need to ask the question of how we empower institutions and what that will look like, what this current setup is going to make the country look like post-Museveni. I think that's very important, because I think that he has historically been a figure that has enjoyed, as I mentioned, a significant amount of autonomy and hegemony that I don't know if any other Ugandan head of state is ever going to master. And so we need to be very clear about the directions that we'll take with the blueprint that others will inherit from him, whether within the NRM itself or within the opposition that comes up. But I'm glad for the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Comrade Olemo. Very, very insightful discussion. Comrade Luere, any parting shots?
Maybe just to refocus us on really the key interventions. I think for me, it's going to be important to reimagine governance, not just governance. Okay, how do we structure our bureaucracy? Is it well positioned to deliver on the ambitious goals we have as a society? A lot of what we have is really leftovers from both colonialism and the deformed evolution, stunted evolution of the state in the time since. So contemporary Ugandans must think carefully around, are the institutions we have for governing ourselves really the most efficient ones that we need, that we would have? Okay, and then we go from there. So the question remains important. I think the bureaucracy is very lethargic. It needs to be rethought, reconfigured, restructured, so that it is more efficient, so that it's more effective, so that it is better attuned to the needs of the people, and that it's in better position to deliver on the needs. So we mustn't lose focus on that important constraint that this work draws our attention to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Comrade Luere. And like I pointed out earlier, gentlemen, for me, this is exciting to just witness scholarship that is alive in terms of happening in real time, but also alive in the sense that it is responding to relevant topical questions that populations and citizens of African countries living today are experiencing. And it's amazing to see the depth and rigor of work and seriousness and the analytical tools that you both bring to these subjects. I'm sure our audience will leave this conversation much more informed and, more importantly, provoked, to start reading between the lines and be able to carry forward the conversation out there in the spaces that you or I may never be able to reach, but where we want Ugandans to take more active attention and active participation in the issues that matter. And so, I would like to ask that we draw today's conversation to a close. It's been a very good 1 3/4 hours, and we look forward to the next edition of the Ideological College and the Fourth Generation Initiative. Over to you, Olemo, in case you have any final service announcements. None?
Yeah, let's keep engaging on the different platforms that exist. But until then, keep alive. In America, they say keep woke, but no, conscientize yourself. And we will see you in that next conversation. Bye.
Bye-bye.